Morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us on this mostly rainy Thursday morning. Once again, massive pleasure to have you all here. This is kind of the final session in this series of webinars on energy data and the supply chain that Beamer and Dansti have worked on together over the last couple of months. It's been a really terrific journey for me. I've learned a lot. I hope those of you who've been involved have too. When I say it's kind of the last, we will be running a workshop early next year, and there'll be some more information about that to follow. But that will be possibly a more technical workshop about how we take what we've learned, how we identify what needs to be done, and then how we go from there. Anyway, thank you all for joining. I'm Jeremy Yap. I'm the head of Flexible Energy Systems at Beamer. And today we're going to talk about maximising the value and benefits of energy data. As you know, because you've registered, you know that we'll be hearing from Jeff Hardy from Grantham Institute and Maxine Frerk from Grid Edge Policy. In a late edition, we're thrilled to be able to welcome also Stuart Reid, who many of you will know. He's the head of Future Networks at SSE Networks, and I'm going to pass to him first because I'm not sure we have him for the whole time. Before we start though, a little bit of housekeeping. So I will be, unfortunately we are without Sarah Sloman this week, so that's a disappointment, but you're stuck with me. So I will monitor the Q&A and the chat. So any comments or questions, please put them there. And we will have time for just a few questions after Stuart has finished speaking, because I realise he won't be able to stay for the whole time. So before we go on further, I'll pass to my friend Chris Pritchett, and yeah, looking forward to hearing all the discussion and learnings from the session. Over to you, Chris.
Lovely, thanks Jeremy. Good morning everybody, and welcome. Thanks very much for coming along, and thank you particularly to our speakers who've joined us today. This has been a really interesting series of seminars for us, and John and I will perhaps do a tiny bit of reflection if we have time at the end, just to sort of wrap that up. But I think that the timing is good. I think the momentum is fantastic on energy data, and I think the realization of the critical importance it plays in the decarbonisation and net zero challenge. Just for those who perhaps haven't joined one of these before, I'm Chris. I'm head of the energy team at Dansti. And energy data has been a particular interest of mine, and perhaps the concept of making some of it open, making some of it interoperable. And I was delighted to work on the Energy Data Task Force with Jeff and Laura and the fantastic group of people. And it's been of a huge excitement to see that mature and roll on, be adopted by BEIS and Ofgem, and start to find its way into the policy decisions that are being made. So that's a huge excitement, and we're delighted to be and stay close to that. And so this is a great opportunity to just take those ideas further, bring in speakers from industry, bring in people's perspectives, and really sort of drive that conversation forward. So thank you very much indeed. And without further ado, I'm going to, before I hand over to Stuart, I was just, by way of anecdote, really excited the other day to see, I don't know if anybody saw this, but the SpaceX launch, which is obviously appealing massively to the nerd in me. And there was a classic moment in there where the NASA or the SpaceX control team were talking to the astronauts, and one by one they passed this floating microphone between each of them. And it got to the fourth guy on the line, and he started speaking. And then the guy at NASA had to say, "I'm really sorry, astronaut, but you're on mute." And it was the most 2020 moment I've ever seen. And then even better, the NASA control person came on and said, Roger, your audio is nominal. So that is it. If we ever get on mute, it's we need audio return to nominal. So with that in mind, Stuart, I can see that your audio is nominal. And without further ado, Stuart Reid from SSE, Head of Future Networks, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Sorry, just joking.
Yeah. I just see him up.
I have to say, the digitalisation is such a big theme at the moment. It's all encompassing. It extends well beyond energy into every aspect of society, and I think one of the big challenges for this sector, for the energy sector, is to recognise that and not to think small in terms of what we can do with data and digitalisation. I'm deliberately keeping the two together because I actually think data in its own is just data. It's how we use that data that's really important. And one of the things I wanted to share with you, I'll just share my screen actually, is an extract from our digitalisation strategy. Hopefully you can see this. In our digitalisation strategy at SSCN, one of the things we've done is kind of broken down what we think the different value streams are for data across our different categories of stakeholder. And there's some really interesting examples in here of how digitalisation and data are going to drive change. And it's change in relation to net zero, but not just net zero. It's about inclusion and all sorts of other factors there. Yeah. So the categories we've got here are firstly our 3.8 million consumers, and for them it's things like the convenience of being able to engage with a network operator through different platforms. A significant proportion of our day-to-day engagement even now is through social platforms and other digital routes, and that's growing. And one of the big things we need to do as an organisation is make sure that we are in a position to accept these new platforms as they come through. And people also want kind of more immediate and more real-time outcomes. If you think about it, you can book a holiday around the world online within a few minutes, as long as your bank account allows it. But to engage through a DNO to get, for example, your home check for EV connection is quite a long and traditional process. So the automation of these processes is really important. That's where it's more than just data. So, for example, that needs to go hand in hand with things like APIs to allow the exchange of information to third-party providers. And I think that's an important feature of how data will be used in the future. One of the scenarios we've been talking about, and it probably jumps me across to the fourth box on this graph here, is the supply chain. One of the things that we want to allow our data and digitalisation strategy to allow is for new forms of partnerships with third-party organisations. And there's two particular types of partnerships we've been talking about that might be of particular interest. The first one we're just calling a data partnership, and that's where data that we would traditionally have within our organisation is opened up to a broader range of participants who can then use that data to produce new value and new services for the DNO. And it's interesting, this is already happening in EDD1 in a relatively small way. We have some organisations within that we work with that we provide data to these organisations. And for example, Kelvitech's one example, they're able to give us fault location data back through the analysis of the data that we have in our system, and that's done real time. So these sort of data partnerships where we're opening up our data for third parties to provide us with services is going to be, I think, a new feature of the transformation to a kind of digital and data-based world. The value of that is obviously that it opens up the data to a lot more thinking. It creates competition in the way that data is utilised, competition to get the best value out of that data. And I think that's a really good thing in terms of how we perform and the sort of experiences that our customers, consumers experience. Yeah. The other type of partnership is where we're opening up data and allowing third parties to provide new services for our consumers directly. And that, in a lot of cases, won't be services that necessarily benefit us as a network operator directly, but benefit the consumer and society in a more broad way. And a good example of that would be if we were to, for example, I mentioned about our electric vehicle connection process at the moment, which will benefit from digitalisation. But under these sort of partnerships, what we're thinking is rather than just having that specific transaction digitalized or opened up, what you do is you open up the process through the APIs. And so you could have scenarios where you're turning up at a showroom to look at a new electric car. You've saved up all your pennies and you're going to make the commitment. And instead of having to contact lots of organizations, the car showroom can have an app on the salesman's phone where you can check whether your home is suitable for a fast charge or slow charge or whatever, and do all that checking there and then while you make that decision. And what that does is removes the friction from the decision-making process that customers have to go through when they're deciding whether to invest in a particular low-carbon technology. And I think that's another area where digitalisation and data is going to start to help with decarbonisation. And the last example I was going to give here is also the relationship with people like planning authorities, local communities, individuals with whole system solutions that they're trying to pull together. I know from personal experience that for a community group or an organisation to actually get the information about the configuration of our network, the needs of the network, and not just our network, all the energy-related assets in an area, whether that be gas or, in fact, even telecoms and the likes, getting that data together to be able to pull together a kind of cohesive proposal for a whole system solution in an area is unbelievably difficult at the moment. You're talking about months and months of data gathering, crunching, validating, and all the rest of it. And opening up data and all appropriate data is a fundamental way of actually increasing the likelihood of whole system solutions getting over the hurdle and getting invested and getting delivered on the ground. So these are just some examples of the sort of things that I think open data is going to allow us to do, and these are kind of quite customer experience and whole system orientated. There is another category as well, which is the use of flexibility under the transition to new distribution system operation functions that we're deploying in the businesses. We want to use flexibility and demand to actually help to manage our network more effectively. So instead of having to reinforce a network as soon as the demand increases in an area, we can contract with flexibility in that area. And for that to work, we need to have healthy marketplaces where flexibility is out there and is there to be contracted with. And open data is a really good way of helping the market to understand where our needs are going to be in future and to allow them to pre-position flexibility across the network in such a way that it's helping to make flexibility work both for the network operator but also for the system operator. And I think that's another big early win in terms of open data, that whole piece about making our requirements and our reinforcement needs visible across the marketplace. Yeah. So as you can see, there's no lack of potential benefits and use cases for open data and digitalisation. The key thing now is making sure that we prioritise on the ones that are going to give the biggest value early and not be distracted into ones that are going to provide require a lot of effort, but also give a lot of early return. So that's going to be the next piece of this story, is kind of identifying these core areas that are most important to help to accelerate the transition to net zero. Okay, so hopefully that's given some food for thought, and I'll just shut down my slide now and open up for any questions.
Amazing, Stuart. Thank you very much. That's a fantastic slide. There's so much there. I feel like we could talk about that a long time. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but fortunately I have one up my sleeve. I was thinking as you were speaking, obviously there are lots of different kinds of data, and I think you touched on, you list quite a few of those on that slide. For me, I think there feels like a big challenge with historical data that people are using for consumer segmentation, and then other kinds of historical data that are maybe more specific to devices or geographic areas, maybe to monitor EV charge point use or to learn more about network constraints and so on. And then clearly there are other kinds of more immediate data in near real-time network information for harmonics, demand, supply, microgrids, and so on. It seems a really, really tall order, like a really big ask to have all of those different kinds of data, which even one kind is incredibly complex, on a platform that you are making decisions based on all those different kinds of data as a sort of a movable feast. So can you talk about, I don't know, what an amazing job you're doing to do that, or what's in the way, what you need help with, what does it look like to you to manage all those different kinds?
I think the first point there I alluded to already, I think, is about prioritising. And I think you take, for example, real-time data on the harmonics in an individual secondary substation feels quite far down the pecking order. And I think it's really important that we link together the use cases to the data and the value to the data. And that's an area where we need, the help is of value, because understanding what these use cases look like, if you make this data available, this is the benefit to society, this is the benefit to the network, that sort of information is really useful. And the thing with data is, data kind of is all about discovery. And which means there's a lot of things you don't know at this particular point in time. So through engagement and understanding, if we've got people inputting in terms of the art of the possible, I think that would be good, because I'm assuming at this point that harmonics at a secondary substation, will not have a big use case at this point in time. And I'm assuming that things like static data, like connectivity and constraints and load flows, but on a kind of static data basis, is a very valuable thing at the moment from a kind of whole system planning perspective. But it's important to understand where it works and where it doesn't work. So basically, just ask, speak, contact us if there's areas that you can see these use cases, then get in touch. That's the biggest ask there, really. Because we don't know all the answers any more than anyone else does, and that's important to kind of recognise that. Yeah. I think the other thing I was going to say is, which is the other side of this, is it's really important with this to remember about some of the unintended consequences and the risks associated with sharing data as well. That's where I think we need to be really careful. And so there's work being done at the moment through the data working group to identify the kind of triage processes for data, because there's, it would be possible to discover quite a lot. For example, if you had harmonics on an individual secondary substation, you could infer a lot about what's going on in the individual homes. Now, is that good? Is that bad? Is it desirable? Is it not desirable? There's a question there to be answered. So it's really important that we think about things like national security, personal security, as well as we release this data. So I think that kind of just harks back to one of the things we see a lot is learning by doing. It's about taking some of these use cases, testing them, trying them, understanding what the pros and cons are, and then moving on from there. Yeah.
So thanks, and that's, Stuart. That answer leads beautifully into the question that we've just had from Paul Barnfather. So thank you, Paul. So there's so much opportunity, but there is uncertainty about the value of flexibility. What is the role of the DNO? Is it to lead and show the way through trials, or is it to actually run these services? And then what you were saying before about learning by doing, I wonder if you could talk about what's the best model to combine the might of the DNOs with the agility of innovators. You may claim that DNOs are agile as well, but
we have our agile moments. Yeah. Yeah. But I think I mentioned before about partnerships, and I think partnerships are a really important part of this. The whole transition to DSO, the whole move to net zero is going to require new skills, skills that we don't have, and similarly as well, it's going to require that sharing of data, but also knowledge and know-how. So it's not just about sharing data; it's about sharing know-how and having these relationships to allow these things to happen quickly. And that's really important. In terms of flexibility, in terms of demand flexibility on the system, it's an interesting. We've had there's a lot of conversations going on about the role of flexibility in DNO. There's a lot of questions still to be answered. Flexibility is being used. We've got flexibility being used on a couple of occasions at the moment, and it is making it cheaper to operate the network in that area. But there's different ways in which you can use flexibility, and part of it depends on what scenarios play out in net zero. If you have a very slow and uncertain uptake of low carbon technologies, then what you end up with potentially that you could have a situation where flexibility is used predominantly to defer and avoid reinforcement. Yeah, but actually, if you have a very rapid uptake and a very certain uptake in low carbon technologies, which is the way it looks like it's going when you look at government policy and so on, then the role of flexibility becomes one more about optimizing your investment. So the investment's going to happen. When are you going to make it? And it's only at the end of that curve, when you've got saturation of your low carbon technologies, that you start to then use flexibility to defer and avoid reinforcement. So that whole methodology is got to be worked out. But the core role of the DNO is to make neutral decisions. To have very clear criteria that you're basing your decisions about flexibility and investment on, and that is another role of data, because making your core data visible means that you can have confidence that you're making a transparent decision, and also evidence the fact that you're making a neutral decision.
So there's a cheeky question from Laurent from Mitsubishi Electric here, but I'm going to go with it. And we can take this offline, Stuart, but there's a cheeky question about whether the DNO would be willing to pay for a license to get access to this data. And I think you're being asked to name the price. So we might come back to that another time. But if you want to talk about that, perhaps just in one more minute, I'm going to segue if you want. The two big challenges, clearly we have a transport and heat. So that's EV charge points and heat pumps, but those are the main bits. And is there any option to consider a diversity factor to fine tune the ADMD in regards to heat pumps? Or you can talk about money if you prefer.
Yeah, I think the money one is an interesting one, because there's data that we have that should be shared as a fundamental part of having a license. There's also data that we have that's not necessarily required to operate the network and may have value. And one of the kind of facetious comments I make occasionally is I've got a fundamental issue with some data being provided and paid for by UK bill payers to allow a third party to run a yacht in the Bahamas. So one of the things we have to discover and yet is what data is provided free and for what, and at what point does the data that we have gathered at the cost of the UK customer, at what point does that get charged for? So I've just turned the question on its head: how much would you be willing to pay for the data to provide services? Right. And there's a whole debate about payment, but the principle we're working on at the moment is there's a set of data that is available, full stop, because it's the right thing to do and it's already there. There may be a subset where there's a different model, and that's where if someone comes in and asks for a level of data beyond that level we would require to operate our network. Right. The diversity in heat pumps, I'm not really sure what that one's getting at. I know what diversity is. I know what heat pump is, but
we might have to pick that. We might have to pick that up later. I think there's a lot more discussion about this. That was very deftly done, Stuart. It's no surprise you've got where you've got to today. That was an excellent turning on its head. Speaking of consumers, so thank you very much for your time this morning. Please stay as long as you can before you
Will do.
away.
Thanks.
But so speaking of consumers, we're hearing now from Maxine Frert from Grid Edge Policy, and Maxine obviously is also involved in the Public Interest Advisory Group on smart metering data. But we're going to hear from her across the piece of all the things she does, not just PAG, I think. So Maxine, it's over to you.
Right, thank you. And in fact, you're mainly going to hear about the PAG project, but I'll explain what that is as part of going through this presentation. So the theme really here is about another value of data, which Stuart didn't actually pick up on, which is to inform public policy thinking. And some right, fine. And clearly, you know, we have a huge challenge ahead of us with decarbonisation, and Jeff is going to be talking a little bit more, I think, about some of these big picture challenges. But in order to navigate us through those challenges, policymakers need evidence. They need data. And the chart below, I think I would badge as one of the most influential charts in energy policy, which is, if you wind back 10 years, everybody sort of said, well, decarbonisation is easy. We'll decarbonise the grid, and then we'll electrify heat and transport, and we're done. And then this chart popped up, which kind of made clear that actually, this is the one that shows, you know, how much more gas demand there is in the winter compared to electricity, and just kind of made the point that if you really want to electrify heat, that creates something of an interseasonal challenge, and the scale of the electricity system that you'd need would be significant. So that, I think, was the turning point at which people did start to debate again options around repurposing the gas grid as a way of decarbonising heat, or as a contribution to decarbonising heat. But it was only by having that data in that very visual way that policymakers kind of had a bit of a second thought. So what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an overview of what the PAG project is, some examples of the evidence gaps that we think we need data to fill, and then just some thoughts perhaps on although I'm talking about smart meter data particularly, I think there's a wider call for help here. So PAG stands for the Public Interest Advisory Group on Access to Smart Meter Data. It's why we call it PAG. And what we've been doing is bringing together key public interest stakeholders to talk about how smart meter data might be accessed for a public interest purpose by government regulators and others that are interested in that public policy debate. And we've really focused, what we call public interest, really focused on the kind of public policy debate. Obviously, there's lots of other kind of what you could say are public interest benefits. And you know, we're now into the second phase of this work, which obviously sits in the wider context, which is why we're here. The starting point for it, it's all about smart metering data. Obviously, we're rolling out smart meters, which provide us with lots of demand side data, half-hourly consumption data, as well as other technical data, as you all know. But privacy considerations were a key element of the design of the rollout of smart metering in the GB, much more than elsewhere. So basically data is held on the meter, and we haven't got a central data repository, and we've got very strict rules about who can access that consumption data, because it gives insights into what's going on in people's homes. But what was not really thought about it, and this is one of my mea culpa moments because I was responsible for that privacy framework, is that we didn't really think about the wider public interest benefit from that data. So I've spent the last couple of years trying to make amends for that through the PAG project. And the end of the first phase, our conclusions were that basically access to smart meter data for public policy purposes is essential to avoid policymakers flying blind into the energy transition. So everybody else is going to have a whole heap of data, and suppliers and innovators are going to be trying to do all sorts of things. And if policymakers don't have some sense of what's going on, they are going to be somewhat disadvantaged in trying to oversee the market and to make wise policy choices. What we also concluded was that there are existing arrangements there that are used to, and that they could build on to access that smart meter data for a public interest purpose while protecting privacy. BEIS still remain very nervous about our line of argument here, because they want to get the smart meters on the walls before suggesting that anybody might have access to data beyond what was provided for. But we continue to try to nudge them along in the right direction. And in particular, arguing that this isn't a question about whether you should have consent. This is, where it is in the public interest that then government and regulators should be able to get access to that data. Which has resonances a bit with anybody who's been following the half-hourly settlement debate, which we have also joined in on. What we're talking about as a route to data is that we would envisage some kind of trusted processor taking smart meter data and creating aggregated or anonymized outputs. Because that's kind of level of data that we are satisfied is what is needed for public policy making. You don't need to know about Mrs. Miggins in 33 Acacia Avenue, but you do need to have a good sense of what the overall patterns of demand are, and some insights into individual behaviour, but not that it's Mrs. Miggins. BEIS do this already in terms of creating the need database. They collect annual estimated reads from suppliers. And part of what we're arguing is you could get even just monthly reads would be a big improvement on annual reads. And the quality of those national statistics is really looking quite outdated now when you think about how much data is available. And the ONS play a similar role in other sectors and have the ability to collect data and link it together in order to provide statistics, and have done a lot, as was highlighted in the National Data Strategy, in particular kind of insights around COVID. Obviously our challenge, as we say, is there's no obvious source for that data, but the DNOs, Stuart, are one of the groups that we have in our sites as a group that do have at least aggregated data. So that's what we were trying to say in phase one, was that this can be done, and there are ways to do it. BEIS remained unconvinced, so phase two have tried to do more use cases or case studies looking at 4 different areas around where you could make improvements. And I'll just step through the last 3 of those to give you examples of where we see data as being able to help fill evidence gaps at present. So the first workshop we had, or the second workshop we had, was on Ofgem's regulatory decision-making role. And when they try to look at the impacts of various policies, it's clear at the minute that their understanding of the distributional impacts, when you're trying to look at the distributional impacts of things like half-hourly settlement or fundamental changes in network charging, they really don't have any way of linking time of use, consumption and demographics to understand the impacts on different groups of customers of their policies. Flexibility, we all know, is really important, but trying to understand from a consumer side how much scope there is and how you might nudge people into taking action is something that Ofgem are very interested in, and but recognise that they don't have any data that can really provide insights on that. On the energy system overall, we've had some powerful presentations from National Grid ESO, reminding us all that FES, that determines so much of our energy policy, is actually, for the demand side, reliant on that annual need data and other kind of top-down data. And that is quite scary when we know how much reliance is placed on FES for all sorts of policy decisions, and how much the clustering of demand actually influences the level of investment that is needed. We've talked about evaluation. At the minute, if you want to evaluate an intervention, you need to set up a whole framework of monitoring. If you had access to smart meter data, you could do that more easily. And Stuart's line about sometimes data is about things you don't know. So when we've been asked to list all the value of smart meter data, we kind of go, well, some of this comes from things you don't know that you're going to find out if you had the data. So that's from Ofgem's perspective, and the kind of chart that we've been talking about there is, there is quite a bit of interesting work going on trying to unpack. This is from Jacopo Toriti at Reading, who does some work looking at diaries of understanding by demographic different customers' activities to try to build up a picture of what their energy consumption might be, and then to analyse that by demographics. Others have looked at kind of you can get data sources that will show you for a small sample of customers different profiles of usage. But the problem we have at the minute is there's nothing that really links demographics and actual demand. So Jacopo's been trying to replicate that by understanding the activities and then estimating the energy consumption off the back of it. But so we're really lacking in that kind of data that helps us understand a lot more in a granular way about what customers are actually doing, and therefore how we can make that transition and make that in a fair way. So the next area which Stuart did touch on is sort of local area energy planning. And I think everybody recognises that we're going to need to do a lot more thinking at a local level. And Ofgem and the Committee on Climate Change and others have talked about local area energy planning. That is reliant on modelling to look across energy, transport and heat. But there are key gaps in the data there around the consumption of heat in buildings, but also just the basic demand patterns. So back to the fact that really all the demand data that is out there and accessible, BEIS data down to the local super output area, is still annual data. It gives you no sense at all of seasonal patterns or daily patterns or peaks. Lots of clever people have been putting lots of effort into trying to find workarounds for these gaps, but our view is that there's no substitute for having the actual data. Although in the interim, if we can get some data, even if we can't get universal data, that could be used for training and refining the models. And then finally, the most recent session that we did was around heat, which we all acknowledge is probably the biggest of the challenges that's outstanding, and where government's still kind of grappling with the policy questions that it needs to work through before deciding what the right pathway is for heat. And it really is it clear to me, we have a complete dearth of information about how we use heat. And the idea that you can kind of take a decision about the way forward for heat decarbonisation based on a lot of technical studies, but no understanding at all of how real people in real houses actually use and heat their homes is quite frightening from a policy point of view. So there's a sort of wave of work that's going on about using smart meter data to understand and improve the energy performance of buildings. BEIS have had a few pilots running using, can you kind of do EPCs in a smart way by using smart meter data? Can you use smart meter data, and people have said, to validate those models that are used to underpin almost all of the energy policy? Any numbers that you see about energy consumption impacts in homes are going to be based on coming out of some key models. People have talked about validating those. I have a concern it's not just about validating the models that, the same household you can have two identical houses with different people in them, and their energy patterns will be very different. So there's a lot here that's not just about understanding the buildings, but understanding how people use their homes. Can be demographics, but it can be lifestyle. Are you working at home or not? and simply individual preferences. So there's an awful lot that we don't understand about how people use heat in their home, and even at the most basic level. Maybe somebody on this webinar can correct me, but I have been unable to find out basic information about space versus hot water heating. The only data from BEIS is in energy usage statistics, which is based on the old model data. It says 23% of gas usage is hot water. That seems an awful lot to me. So some basic stuff that we just don't know, and a sense that smart meter data, aggregated and anonymized, but at a more granular level than just annual, would allow us to get some insights into an awful lot of this important debate around heat. And this is just...
Sorry, Jeremy, just a gentle 1 minute warning.
Yes, sorry. And this is a chart that I pulled out, which the best data that was there in a recent report. They'd had to use a sample from 19 homes in 2006 to get a pattern of gas demand usage. So the final slide is really just saying, although we are arguing about this from a smart meter data perspective, there are all sorts of other sources of demand side data that people will be aware of. We recognise there are privacy and commercial issues, but again, aggregated and anonymised data could help provide some of those insights, either sharing data with academics or providing data confidentially to government, or just publishing some summary data and insights. And this rather fuzzy stolen slide is from TADO, which put out a press release last year about using smart thermostats to demonstrate how poor the energy efficiency in UK buildings was. That's not commercially confidential or private, but actually is a good wake-up call for us all, that we need to do more about our housing stock to tackle heat. So encouraging everybody to think about data that they have and how that could be used to help with public policy making.
So Maxine, thank you very much. There's a lot to think with there and a lot to respond to. So there will be some opportunities for questions and answer and chat after Jeff's spoken, and there's at least one question there in the Q&A. So please do write your questions there and we'll pick them up now. So let's hold that thought and go to Jeff Hardy from Grantham Institute. Thank you very much for being with us, Jeff. The floor is yours, the screen.
Wonderful. Yeah, the virtual floor. Awesome. So good morning, everyone. Jeremy, thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go back to the big picture in what I'm going to talk about here. So I'm going to kind of like put into context at the end of all of this really the challenges of decarbonisation and why data is a solution, notwithstanding the points we've just heard about whether or not you can get hold of it. So I work in the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London. I'm part of a large research consortium called the Energy Revolution Research Consortium, and that consortium is part of the government's Prospering from the Energy Revolution Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And what that means is we as a research consortium are getting to study in real time a bunch of projects that are trying to demonstrate smart local energy systems of the future today in real places around the UK, both in terms of actual physical projects with business models behind them through to detailed design type projects. As it happens, I'm not going to talk all that much about that today, but a lot of the challenges that I'm going to talk about in my presentation relate back to what they're trying to do in these projects. And I'll loop back around to some of the outputs that we've had recently from our research consortium. So first up, I don't really need to tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. So the UK is on this net zero journey, and it's always worthwhile reflecting on what that means, because sometimes we just see it as a sense of words and so forth. But what net zero means is that by 2050, UK can have no economic activities producing any greenhouse gases. It's zero. And therefore, if you have an area of the economy, let's say agriculture, that cannot stop producing greenhouse gases, then another aspect of the economy, let's say electricity generation, has to do negative carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And it's just worthwhile saying that that's the trade-offs you're going into with net zero. If one area can't do it, another area is going to have to go negative. So it's a big challenge and an exciting one. And that's just really reiterating what it says in the Climate Change Act there, which is that by 2050, greenhouse gas emissions need to be at least 100% lower than the 1990 baseline, and that's to allow for that negative emissions aspect. Now, I like to put things in a different sort of context. So I was looking at the National Grid Future Energy Scenarios model. This was 2019 version, so it's actually been updated since. And as it happens, you know, with the 10-point plan, some of these figures might even be out of date with some of the ambitions on, say, bringing forward the phase out of internal combustion engines in transport, and also the aspirations on offshore wind. But let's put it in context. So the UK, to meet its net zero targets in the energy sector, needs to be deploying about 3.6 gigawatts a year of renewables, particularly offshore wind, but also lots of other things. So in context, that's about 300 of those absolutely massive, taller than the Shard turbines a year, every year. At the same time, over the next 30 years, we need to be deploying 1.2 million battery electric vehicles a year, or if you like, that's 136 per hour for the next 30 years. And at the same time, we need to be installing around 600,000 installations of heat pumps per year. So that's about 68 an hour. And if anyone remembers what it says in the 10-point plan, that is miraculously the same figure as what the government committed to in 2028, 600,000 heat pumps a year. Now, in green is where we're at the moment. So actually, on renewable electricity, it's a good news story. We actually have been installing for the last decade about 4 gigawatts of renewable electricity a year. Brilliant. On transport, it also looks like a good story because we're replacing 331 vehicles an hour in the UK. However, in the most part, that's an internal combustion engine or an internal combustion engine. And with boilers or with heating, then we're replacing about 182 boilers an hour. But as you probably know, most of those replacements are gas boilers or gas condensing boilers for gas condensing boilers. So this isn't a challenge of being able to do this. It's a challenge of reconfiguring the supply chain so that it's delivering zero carbon alternatives to what we have at the moment. The numbers are completely doable. However, technology cannot do everything. So this is a slide from the Committee on Climate Change Analysis on net zero. And what it's really saying is that around 38% of the measures that we need are pure technology switches. So replace this with that and you achieve zero carbon. The rest of it, the other 62%, involves some sort of behavior change. So either in combination with a technology, like getting used to a new heating system or a new vehicle, or completely and solely societal or behavioral changes like diet or choosing not to fly, that kind of thing. So behavior is absolutely intrinsic to this zero carbon transformation, and therefore information and engagement and education also is increasingly important. So let's just talk really briefly about data and energy consumers, because we've heard a lot about the detail and the really good case studies we've had already. So I'm going to simplify this down to the 4 Ds, which no doubt you'll all be very familiar with. And if any of my fellow presenters are not on mute, could you please be on mute, because I'm getting a bit of background noise. So we have 4 Ds. One of which is decarbonize, one is decentralize, one is digitalize, and one is democratize. And the reason why I put these up there, decarbonize, you can see that there's a scale of ambition that needs to flow alongside, that needs to deploy a lot of technologies. But what that also means is you're putting an awful lot more assets into the system. So you're going to have a lot more technology. So you're going to go from, let's say on the electricity generation side, 60 or 70 very large assets from the past to millions of electricity generating assets. And that's because many of those assets are decentralizing in nature. So if you think about electricity generation going forward, there's scenarios that show that perhaps 50 or 60% of the electricity generation assets are going to be local, alongside all of those millions of electric vehicles, alongside all of those millions of heat pumps. So what that means is if you're going to have a very smart system that's minimizing the size of the electricity grid you need to build, minimizing the amount of assets that you need to deploy in order to meet your net zero targets, you're going to have to coordinate across all of those new assets so that you can achieve all of those efficiencies. Now, digitalizing is what we've already talked about today, and that's the combination of data and new platforms and new ways of doing things. So, realizing flexibility at a local scale, flexibility platforms, or new trading platforms, or new ways of connecting people and energy and devices together, all of those kind of things. They are all going to be fueled by data, but they're going to be running new services off the back of that. So new propositions to consumers, new ways of doing things. And part of that might be because we're ending up democratizing to some extent. So we might be thinking about having peer-to-peer energy in the future, maybe local energy markets, all sorts of different ways of configuring the energy system and the kind of like in the virtual layer, or in the way in which we exchange energy with one another or gift energy to one another. So there's lots of things going on, and they all require data, and they will all require some new platforms in order to allow some of the magic to happen in this. Now, I quite like this electronic spaghetti diagram from the World Economic Forum. It's quite an old report now, but it sort of worked for me because it shows a couple of things. One is it shows that consumers are going to be potentially much more active in the energy system. So that's the left-hand side of the diagram. They're going to be able to produce, consume, store, and sell electricity, very active participants. And at the same time, on the right-hand side, we're going to have the potential of automated technology and analytics are going to influence how consumers consume and contribute new energy services. So what that means is there's going to be some mix between very active and engaged and directly engaging consumers and other consumers that are going to be working through intermediaries or through artificial intelligence or something like that to provide those services, but perhaps without too much hassle on their behalf. Because one of the big things we have in energy at the moment is this assumption that we will move to more cost-reflective pricing in the system, and that will drive all of this amazing consumer behavior, both business and domestic consumer behavior. So the price of energy might be different every half an hour, and therefore your behavior will be different every half an hour. But let's be honest, we are not going to turn into a nation of smart meter or in-home display unit watchers. We're not going to be following those price signals. Someone or something is likely to have to sit in between the consumer and the electricity system in order to reduce this complexity, take on board some of the risks like pricing risk, and do this in a service-orientated way so that consumers can get on with their lives and not face really high prices because they happen to put the kettle on at the wrong time. Now, in more context on this, already you can get a tariff that is cost reflective. So I'm on Octopus Agile. I'm lucky enough to have solar panels and a battery. And the left-hand side of that slide is just my battery eating up free electricity, or rather better than free. I was paid to consume electricity on that particular day. But I'm able to pay. And that is not necessarily the case for many consumers. Because if we're going to ask people to change their vehicle, change the heating system, it's going to require new kit going into homes. And much of that kit has got very high upfront costs. So let's say a heat pump might cost quite a bit more than installing a gas boiler at the moment. That's just how it is now. It might change going forwards. But it also requires a slightly different operational cycle to a gas boiler. So you've got to get used to it as a consumer. All of this, A, could be quite unfair, You know, so if it's only on an able to pay basis, then some consumers are going to be left behind, but also it's going to be much more complicated. It could go badly wrong for consumers if they were left to face that complexity all on their own. So what I'm going to argue briefly is that there is a big opportunity for new businesses to come into the market. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. If anyone likes to read a pointy-headed academic paper, then you can read one that my colleagues and I put together. But what it was basically saying is that there's going to be something like £21 billion of value available to electricity utilities if they can start to provide these services that take away some of that complexity from consumers. And that's per year by 2050. You know, once you've got a very zero carbon energy system, but it increases year on year from now to 2050 up to that value. So it's worth it. In context, that's about a third to half the whole electricity supply market currently on the domestic side. And we also did some work, so excuse the kind of like the strange bubble diagram, but we also did some work that was basically saying, right, well, are consumers interested in some of these propositions that are a bit different, like an energy service company selling you comfort instead of electricity units, or a company that was going to take quite a lot of control over devices in your home? I called it third-party control, but it could be Google runs your life. That's the sort of idea of that one. Or even peer-to-peer energy, where they were getting kind of like trading with each other. So the first bit from this slide in a paper that's in review at Nature Energy at the moment is that about 50% of consumers are up for it. They're up for a different sort of model that isn't the sort of same but smart model on the left-hand side of this. The second one was that people really wanted peer-to-peer energy. And when we dug into the stats on that, it was because there was quite a large segment of consumers who do not trust anyone, don't trust their electricity supplier, barely trust the police. And that is, once they saw there was no contract with an intermediary, then it was, that was it. They were going to choose that regardless. Just checking if I'm getting a 1 minute warning yet. Not yet. Good. Right. So I'm going to.
You're okay, Jeff. You
brilliant.
On, you've got a few.
All right. Well, I've only got a couple of slides left anyway. So let's just go into barriers and challenges to innovation, because I'm talking a lot about a future which is very data driven, which has got a lot of digitalization, creating new services for energy consumers, all of that. And some new business models operating that kind of provide consumers with quite a different energy experience. So can such things get into the market today? And the answer is not really. So I used to work, like Maxine, I used to work at Ofgem. I was head of Sustainable Energy Futures. And one of the things that was clear to me when I was doing some work on something called non-traditional business models is that the institutional relationships in the electricity system, or rather the rules of the game, if you want to participate, are pretty complicated and they're quite prescriptive. So this is the left-hand side here is a brilliant slide from Exeter University, and it's regulatory spaghetti, if you like. It's basically that combination of rules and institutions and licenses and codes and standards that you have to adhere to if you're going to be part of this system delivering an essential service. Now, I'm not saying at any point here that these rules aren't important. They absolutely are. Energy and electricity and gas are essential services. People die if they don't have it. However, this regulatory spaghetti, if I take it over to the right-hand side of this diagram, this system of rules and regulation means that, say you wanted to be a bit different, like a Beetle was peer-to-peer energy or an Owl was an energy service company, by the time you've been through that funnel, been through this regulatory spaghetti, actually, by the time you come out the other end, you all end up looking quite similar. So in this instance, you all end up looking like dogs, but you might all end up looking like basically an electricity supplier that is selling a commodity and is unable to do some of the things you wanted to do because of all of the prescription. It's the only thing you can be at the end of this. So final slide, I think. I just wanted to draw your attention to some work that we're doing within the Energy Revolution Research Consortium, which is looking at some of the policy and regulation landscape and issues. So we've done 2 reports so far. We've done one on electricity storage and electric vehicles. We've done one on digital energy platforms, and we're just finishing an absolute beast on heating and cooling and energy efficiency and hydrogen at the moment. And what these reports are doing is laying out what the landscape is from a policy and regulatory point of view for these sort of essential building blocks of smart local energy systems. And what we're also trying to do is to draw out some of the cross-cutting issues that are coming on. So some of the cross-cutting issues that come through really strongly are things like interoperability, you know, between devices, between data, between all of those things. Because if you want to have this integrated, coordinated, efficient, working energy system of the future, all of these new bits of kit are going to have to be able to talk to each other and coordinate to get the best results out of it. Other things that come out of it really strongly are things like build it once and build it smart. You don't want to have to be going back in and retrofitting a net zero device. So you don't want to do an energy efficiency retrofit and then 10 years later have to do it again because it isn't compatible with net zero. You know, so there's a lot of lessons in this about getting it right and doing it once. And I think data and digitalisation is a real important aspect of knowing what the right thing to do is and how to do the thing right in that. So if anyone's interested in any of the other findings of those, I'm happy to waffle on about them during Q&A, but I think at this point I'll stop talking and hopefully pick up some of the questions that you've been asking that I've seen been popping up.
So Jeff and Maxine and Stuart, I'm not sure if you're still on the call, but thank you, all three of you. That's three quite complementary and different, but fascinating presentations. So really grateful for that. I definitely do want you to waffle about those things, Jeff, but not straight away. We'll come to the other questions first, if we may. Before we start that, I just want to respond to one thing you said, if that's all right. So I was on another panel earlier this week, Elemental, I think it was, and it was one of the people on the panel was Simon Ayres, who's the CEO of Trustmark, and BEMA does a lot of work with them. We're very associated with them, government-backed organisation, and we were talking about how important it is not just for consumers to understand the payback times for their new kit, whether it's a microgeneration or heat pumps or something. But Stuart, thank you very much for your time. I realise you've got to go. Thank you. But also how important it is to verify with confidence those payback times. So I think that's something that we as an industry and as a device supply chain, and this is for other organisations such as Renewable UK and others, to think about how we go about not just saying, well, these things, the costs are coming down and we can see a business case or we can see a consumer case, but actually to verify with confidence the payback times for new kit. That's enough talk from me. I'm going to go to Paul's question. And I think, Paul, you typed this when Maxine was speaking, but very interested to see the conclusion that access to national interest data shouldn't rely on consent. What was the reason for this? Would it not be an option to leave consent with customers while offering appropriate incentives and encouragement to grant access? I fear compulsion will only cause backlash. So Maxine, that's not quite how I understood what you said, but I'm going to give that to you, Maxine, if you can take that question, and then if others want to chime in.
Fine. I mean, it's worth saying, you know, we were very, I might have sounded a bit flip about the privacy issues, but, you know, we did put a lot of time into thinking about privacy, working through all the kind of legal issues on privacy, working through all the consumer research that had ever been done on consumer attitudes to privacy around smart meter data, and held a workshop with experts on that. So, you know, some of this is about where is it right for customers to have to share their smart meter data. And, you know, the existing framework, for example, requires, you know, says DNOs can have access to half-hourly customer data for running their networks, but they then have to aggregate it and anonymise it as soon as they get hold of it to protect it against privacy. But they can have it, and that is understood as being, you can't kind of run a network depending on who's given you consent. And I would say the same applies for government national statistics. You can't have a set of national statistics that says this is the energy consumption for people who've decided to share their data with us. So part of what we've been trying to go through in this process is working out which are the things where it really is reasonable to say this only makes sense if you get everybody's data. You can do it in a way that privacy is protected because it's aggregated or anonymized. And there are other ways that, you know, one of the projects that funded us at the very beginning, I should have said this was done with Sustainability First at CSE, was UCL, and they've now got the Smart Energy Research Lab set up, which ultimately will have data from 10,000 households who have all opted in and given their consent and agreed to be part of this project. And that data will be then linked with lots of other demographic data and surveys and allow some of that, some of those kind of questions around distributional impacts to be better understood, for example. I raise a question still as to whether you're going to get a completely representative sample when you go for consent. And you know, some people may deliberately opt out so you don't get the full picture. And you can't tell without having the full data. But you know, you can go a long way with the UCL data. Is really valuable and give a lot of insights, particularly on the heat space. So part of what we're trying to do in our latest round is actually work out where the real value add comes from in terms of needing national data. But you know, privacy is an important issue, but there are certain levels of data where it just doesn't make sense to do it on an opt-out basis. Yeah.
So that's an important distinction. Thank you. Further to the UCL work, and not just the Smart Energy Research Lab, but others, I know, John Parsons, you're going to have a little bit of time, I promise, later on in the session, and we might have a short discussion about not just energy data, but product data and the role of that. But first, Laurent, a question from you in regards to getting it right and doing it once. We see properties developments shifting to gas heating because electricity grid reinforcement is far too expensive. Therefore, these developments are likely to not meet the requirement in a few years. That's going against what we are trying to achieve. I could not agree more. I think this is a huge policy challenge, and Jeff and Maxine, you have 30 seconds each to solve it.
Brilliant.
Time starts now.
I'm going to save you some time by talking about Laurent's first question as well, because I think they're related a little bit. So there's an underlying question here about the role of DNOs in this net zero transition, and I think a lot of this is really live as they start to put together their business plans for Rio ED2, because it's going to be, as you can see from the government's 10-point announcement, it's going to be a really hot period. And I think the DNOs are positioning themselves as facilitating this transition. But if you look at the consumer research and the customer research that they're undertaking, actually they're seen by customers want them to lead this transition. There's a load of stuff mixed up in here about strategic investment ahead of needs, kind of like making sure the networks are there when these technologies come, which of course the regulator is going to be quite nervous about. However, let's just talk about the link between data and that certainty. You know, at the moment, Maxine has rightly pointed out that sometimes there just isn't data flows available of these technologies, the impacts they have on the, you know, be they heat pumps, electric vehicles, kind of new housing developments. But, you know, we're getting increasing deployment. We're getting lots of good trials. We're getting a much better sense of how they perform in reality, how they perform in real life, and all of that kind of thing. So data can really help improve the certainty of DNOs. But I think that DNOs and the regulator are going to have to look at this and say, if net zero is the unmovable national strategic priority, then the network is going to have to be there, because otherwise, why are we bothering with a target? You know, when we know with some certainty the sorts of technologies we're going to need to achieve that. There is a lot bundled up in here. It's going to go very slightly over 30 seconds, but this access and forward charging reform that's underway is massively important, because it talks about kind of like what the connection boundary is, how deep the charging it is going to be for connections, your access rights to the network, you know, how flexible your connection is going to be, all of that kind of stuff. Plus, of course, how you're going to get charged for network not yet built, and how that's going to play through in an efficient way. Hugely important. Not yet settled, won't be, I think, until after the bloody business plans are in, sorry for swearing, but there we have it. So yeah, that's super important, but I think networks are going to have to play a leading role in this, and that means sorting out exactly the sort of issues that Laurent is rightly pointing out in his questions.
Shall I just add 30 seconds? So I totally agree on access and charging reform, and I think that is key to some of this. I'm not sure the regulator is very good on kind of how you get your head around fairness in this context. Are you trying to deliver net zero, or are you trying to send kind of neutral price signals to ensure that locational signals, are you trying to deliver net zero and do it in a fair way? I think the other one I'd put on the table is building standards. And I guess short form version of my worry about building standards is they don't understand flexibility. And therefore the idea that you need to incorporate storage of some form into properties, and you need to think about how to enable flexible heat, not just making sure you're not getting anything that might be a bit leaky, and current obsession with leakiness means you don't want storage because that tends to leak heat, whereas actually you need storage to provide flexibility. So there's a bit there on building standards, which must be the way to make sure that people put the right sort of heat ultimately into new built homes.
That's absolutely critical, Maxine, to the work that selfishly I'm going to Beamer again, that the work that Beamer will be looking to do. We're and I think that's expressed extremely well, the idea that building regs as they stand now and standards don't actually understand and promote the role of flexibility. I'm going to put it in the chat later, but I just want to plug a recent Beamer publication, Future Ready Homes, which is, as per both of the speakers just now, we're not describing how to build a 2050 style home now, but we describe 12 easy things that you can do now that make your home future ready. So makes it ready for a low carbon and ideally also a warmer world. We've got time for just one more question, and then I'm going to pass to John and Chris to wrap up. There's a question here about data poverty and fuel poverty and adequate protection. I think we've discussed that a little bit now, and I think we understand that that service models need to change. So instead, would anyone like to express a view on the low voltage level data that DSOs and others will need, and how we see the smart metering system's role in that? Can traditional smart meters provide all that information? What's going to happen? What's going to need to happen in addition?
So I'll start off on this one.
Yeah.
So I had an interesting conversation with UKPN on this as part of the PAG work, and their line was that actually access to smart meter data, that part of their challenge is trying to find out where heat pumps and things are being installed that are going to cause some pressure on the system. Their line was, smart meter data is actually really valuable for giving you an initial indication that an area might have some challenges, at which point you then invest in the LV monitoring, which costs a bit of money, so you don't want to stick it in now everywhere. So the smart meter data does have a role for them in highlighting where to put in that LV monitoring equipment, and then you use the LV monitoring equipment to then take a view as to whether or not you're going to want to reinforce or go down the flexibility route. But I thought it was quite a nice little sequence. Use the cheap and existing data now to work out where you might need to study more.
That's news to me. I think that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to John Parsons and Chris Pritchett now. I think, John, you're going to take it first. Just to have some reflection on the series so far. That's probably it for me. I'm down to do a little next steps and thanks, but just to say we will be holding a workshop early in the new year where we will look at interoperability of all these things, the devices, the data types, policies and consumers, markets, how we take this forward as an industry, as a trade association and as a group. I hope you all want to be involved in that. So thank you very much. It's been an honor and a privilege to work on this series. Pass now to John and Chris, but thank you once again.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can you all hear me okay? I'm sitting in the conservatory and the rain's getting louder on the roof. So this is climate
John,
impact.
your audio is nominal.
I'm not sure this is climate change. It's definitely climate impact. Okay, so I apologize anyway. But no, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this series. I congratulate all the speakers and Jeremy and Chris and all the people at Anstey. It's been really interesting. I've got three key themes I've picked up out of this I'd like to sort of try and just sort of talk about briefly. So basically, what data, what do we want it for, and who pays, I think is going to be an important issue. I'm going to start off by establishing just how old I am. Because back in the 1980s, late 1980s, I was working at British Gas Research and Technology. I was leading a project developing a micro CHP product, and we really wanted to know about what customers did with energy. I had the only remaining data set from what British Gas used to do, which is a five-yearly survey, really big detailed survey of customer usage of gas. They knew everything about it. It was a 10-volume printed thing, so you didn't have it was that old. So it only existed as a paper copy. I had the last copy. When we privatized the energy industry, before then, the gas and electricity industry spent a lot of money trying to understand what customers did with their energy so that they could win customers off each other, so they could convert people from gas to electricity and vice versa. When the industry was privatized, the supply companies basically, they supplied both gas and electricity, and they decided that their business model was winning customers from each other, and they lost interest in what people did with their energy. And that was a really expensive exercise, getting that data set. It was done every 5 years, and no one would pay for it after privatization. So I was amazed ever since then, all the work I've done, just how little the energy industry understands how people use their energy. I have to say, picking up from Maxine, what she said, we have never needed more to know how customers use energy and what they do with it. It's a critical thing for deciding policy and so on. What's important to me, I think, is it's just the fact that it's so much cheaper to gather it now, because there is so much electronic equipment being used. The getting the data is becoming much simpler and much easier and much more comprehensive. So there's a lot more, but there are some interesting questions coming up. So I picked up three reasons for the data, the energy data. So one is for DNOs and so on to improve their businesses and to run better. There's people wanting yachts in the Bahamas, making businesses out of it. And then, as Maxine said, there's policy, there's regulation, there's people wanting to know about it so they can make sensible decisions. There's going to be some very interesting questions about how you pay for all of this and how you partition the cost for the different uses, etc. I'm looking forward to the ED2 business plans coming out. And I think ED2 determinations will be very interesting in how they sort of Ofgem approaches the paying for all of this. Okay, product data and operational data. So part of my job at BEMA, as well as looking after energy data side of it, is looking at product data. So this is where our members, manufacturers, have lots of information about their products, so how big it is, all this sort of stuff. It seems very different in a way, because it's about the data, it's about the product rather than about the use of the data, the energy. But what I find interesting is beginning to blur and come together. So something like a heat pump, you might sort of have some information about a heat pump as a manufacturer, but where it is, who's using it, starts becoming part of the operational data. And it sort of starts overlapping. And also, I think what's interesting is that the challenges are very similar. So you have lots of organizations that have huge amounts of data, but often in very different places. There are about hundreds of spreadsheets and so on. And those organizations are going through a process at the moment, I think, of bringing all that data together and sort of setting up structured databases and so on so that they can properly understand their data. Once you've got that, you then have interesting questions around what do you make public, how do you make it secure, what do you use it for, etc., etc., and also making sure it's all consistent. So what voltage is in one supplier is voltage is the same meaning of voltage somewhere else. It's all really important stuff, which I think, important point. So we were sort of complaining about not the supply chain not being involved enough in all of this, which is why we sort of started off on this. One of the important points I sort of noted early on was that there's an awful lot of expertise in the supply chain actually on digitalisation, and we're not necessarily very good at bringing that out and using that and making use of that in this area. Finally, my D is doing it. So the role, I think the platforms, the energy data platforms are really important, I think. Once they start getting established, they will start driving standards because they will need to understand the data that they're collecting and passing on. And that becomes really important. I think they'll also start seeing what's missing and pushing, I think, to get hold of some of the data that's not being made available. But there's a comment, I think, from our IBM speaker. Basically, don't let perfection get in the way of getting on with it. And I think his view was standards are slow, generally, and they will get in the way if you're not careful. So his view was like, just let's start doing this and tidy up afterwards. My view was, I strongly agree with that, to be honest, but I always think it's helpful when you're doing something where you're not quite sure where you're headed, if you can sort of get some vision about what you would like it to look like, roughly, so you've got some idea of where you're headed without having sort of clear descriptions or decisions early on. It's let it flow, but have an understanding of where you want it to go. And I'd be interested in where that vision is going to come from and how we develop it. And so the key question at the beginning, I think, was should the supply chain be involved in developing all of this? And just to sum up everything we've heard, I think basically this is a time of huge disruption and innovation. So there's lots of people who have new and unknown needs. Lots of people have new solutions. Lots of people have interest in all of this. Basically, I would say everyone needs to be involved in making this happen. Everyone should be. Okay, thank you. And thanks again to all the speakers and to Jeremy and Chris and everyone for a really interesting series.
Lovely, thank you, John. And yeah, that's my final thought. Thank you ever so much, guys, for the presentations today. Absolutely fascinating. I'm in an interesting position that my wife's a data protection lawyer and a real GDPR specialist, so we have some great, I mean, it's a bit of a nerdy household, but we do have fantastic conversations, particularly on this question of smart meter, because I agree 100% with Maxine. It is needed, and I think the question of how we do that and do we do consent, I think I'm very much on the side of it needs to be done, but also reinforcing the messages about keeping data on the meter, processing at the grid edge, and not creating some unnecessary central repository to do it. We need to do this at distributed level and give people try and build that trust. So it does come down to trust, and I think my way of wrapping this up, again, picking up on John's final thought, is that we all need to do this together. It needs to be done in consortia with everybody else. And I'm minded I can give my distinction between cooperation and collaboration. And cooperation is something that really you have to do, and sometimes you're forced to do, and you have no choice but to do. Collaboration is different. It talks about a degree of generosity towards another party and a willingness and a mutual benefit and a shared objective. And I think that's the philosophy we need here. It's not about, where possible, trying to steal each other's customers or trying to sort of build there is a greater business model to be built for everyone's benefit and for the benefit of the consumers. And I think people can genuinely collaborate on it, and that requires, a two-way street. And as I say, a degree of that generosity, then that is how we move this forward. So in 30 seconds, it's impossible to wrap up, but this has been a really fascinating and enjoyable series to work on with Beamer. So thank you, John and Jeremy, very, very much. And thank you to Sarah at our end for coordinating. And I really just hope that this can stimulate further discussion. Thank you to all the attendees and listeners who contributed to the Q&A and all the discussion. And we just, hopefully we can continue to build this community and together make it all go a lot faster. So Jeremy, final word, and thank you once again.
Thanks again. 2020 has been a really difficult year in so many ways. This goes down as easily, far and away, one of the very best things I've been involved in. It's, I hope that doesn't sound self-congratulatory. It's not meant to. The speakers have all been fantastic. Great to work with Food Anstey. Chris and I have been talking about this for years to try and find a way to work together, and it's brilliant that we've done this. It's not such a cliche, but this is really just the start of a long journey for us. So if you've enjoyed this session, if you've enjoyed this series, please tell your friends and colleagues and employees about it. They have been recorded. Links to those recordings are on Food Anstey's website. We look forward to speaking to as many as possible of you next year when we sit down and really start to talk about what does interoperability mean, and what does delivery of all these things of all these benefits that data can provide mean, and how are we going to collaborate best to deliver those. Nothing more from me except to say thank you very much to everyone, and have a safe and happy holiday season. We look forward to catching up with many of you again in the new year. So thank you again.